A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization supported entirely by your donations. If you've ever enjoyed one of our podcast episodes, community, or classes, please consider making a donation of any size right now on our website at skepticspath.org. There you can also find links to purchase the book based on the podcast, How to Train a Happy Mind, or join our Train a Happy Mind community that meets weekly for lectures, meditations, and discussions. I'm Scott Snibbe, and this is A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment, where we share practical ideas from Buddhism to build happier lives, stronger relationships, and a better world. A big crowd showed up for the San Francisco book launch for How to Train a Happy Mind a couple months ago to listen to me in conversation with my dear friend and fellow Buddhist teacher, Tenzin Chogkyi. You may remember her from a podcast episode last year where we talked about patriarchy, gender, and sexism in Buddhism. Listen now to our lively conversation about the book, how Buddhism is adapting to our culture, and whether or not we can still call it Buddhism.
So welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out to this event. And so what we'll do, I have been enthusiastically gobbling up the book and writing down lots of cool questions for Scott. So that's how we're going to start. It's going to start with an interview, and then we'll open it up to you all in case you have questions. So we'll start out with our conversation. And you quote from His Holiness in his book, Beyond Religion, where he says, "The time has come to find a way of thinking about spirituality and ethics that is beyond religion." And then you also quote Lama Yeshe, who's the founder of our own tradition of Buddhism, who says, "Give up religion, give up Buddhism, go beyond Buddhism, put the essential aspect of the philosophy into scientific language," which is what I think is your marching orders. Reading the book, that really feels like you've taken inspiration. And so I'd love to hear more about these ideas and how they've really inspired you.
A teacher I met recently, Geshe Tenzin Namdak, who was a Western Geshe, he said the purpose of Buddhism is not to make more Buddhists. It's to generate happy minds. And that's what His Holiness said in his book. As you can tell by reading the news, the world has some ethical problems that we're dealing with. And it's very unclear what the solutions are. I think there's a lot of lack of clear thinking and ethical thinking, compassionate thinking. And you have this ancient system that's extraordinarily well developed. So then the question is, what aspects are cultural? What aspects of, say, Tibetan Buddhism or Indian Buddhism are cultural, and what aspects are essential to what the Buddha taught? And some people like Stephen Batchelor or Robert Wright take a more aggressive approach to this idea of secularizing Buddhism, where they say, like I just interviewed Stephen Batchelor a couple days ago, and he takes a pretty aggressive stance and says the Buddha didn't even say that. The Buddha didn't believe in reincarnation. So I'm not so sure. And then Robert Wright says, it's all evolutionary psychology. You can explain this through science. And some of that is really true. My perspective is more like, it's just an invitation that it's quite clear that most people in our culture don't believe in reincarnation, past and future lives, karma. And so what is a way to practice this path as authentically as possible within the worldview that we were raised? Let's just set aside whether those things are true or not. We can't prove them through science. And it's completely reasonable not to accept those beliefs that people weren't raised with in our culture. So then it was kind of a little bit of a creative struggle trying to figure out. I was invited to start teaching meditation 18 years ago by our friend. Venerable Chogkyi, to teach this sequence that's called the Lam Rim. And it's a distillation of the Buddha's teaching into an order that they say is particularly effective for reaching enlightenment, if you believe that's possible. But certainly for diminishing your disturbing states of mind and increasing the ones that are satisfying, fulfilling, happy, for lack of a better word. And so that process was one of talking to my teachers, including yourself, reading His Holiness, which was probably the most encouragement I felt for taking on this project and getting a lot of feedback. But a lot of why I did this was because of negative feedback. Because when I started trying to teach these meditations the authentic way in a class where we said it's open to everybody, you don't have to be a Buddhist, then in the first line of the first topic of the Precious Life, it says, hey, listen, you've been a ghost, a turtle, a god for infinite past lives. Now you're a human, which is the best state, but watch out because you're burning up your karma and you might be reborn in a hell realm. So you better take this life to generate positive karma. So it mentions all those three things that people would consider supernatural in our culture right in the first topic. And I felt a real sense of pain when I would see people come into the meditation class and then maybe leave forever. You know, like it was the first and last time they stepped into our center and meditated. So I just felt like it was, I should meet people where they're at.
Well, you know, I've noticed in my own sort of evolution as a teacher, feeling like I've too become kind of more and more of a disciple of His Holiness with this view of, you know, there's so much that's precious in Buddhism. What a shame if it were just restricted to people who are interested in the religious aspects, which seems to be very few. And, you know, after teaching very traditionally for many years, I took the Cultivating Emotional Balance teacher training and then the Compassion Cultivation training. And seeing the value, like you say, of can we make things accessible to people in a way that's just makes sense for modern people in their modern minds. So I love that you've really been doing this. It's kind of a work of translation, it feels like, to me, you know, translating these concepts and even the way you're sort of translating the explanations to scientific language. I'm a former scientist too, so like subatomic particles, like let's look at things that way, or even the way that you explain the precious life in terms of evolution. I love the way that you've done that. And so I'm just kind of wondering what led to that. Is it just you kind of thinking about things or talking to different people, or you know, for the scientific explanations you have of these traditional topics that is quite different?
Well, you know, for a Buddhist, the sense of urgency comes from that feeling of I've had infinite past lives and this is a really good one and I better make the most of it. It's a sense of awe. So that was the hardest. I almost skipped that topic, actually, the precious life, because it seemed like the most difficult one to adapt. But then I started thinking, okay, how can an ordinary person have a sense of awe? And I just thought of how I did when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I watched this show Cosmos, the first one with Carl Sagan. You know, the second one's really good too. That, for me, when I was a kid, was an extraordinary sense of awe. The idea that humanity is 200,000 years at the tip of 14 billion years, and 100 billion galaxies, 100 billion stars. Now we know there's 100 billion planets that could support life in our galaxy. And then evolution took 4 billion years, right? And then right at the tip of that are us, beings that are self-aware. Carl Sagan said, we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Humanity might be the consciousness of the universe itself. For all we know, we are. And how are we doing on that? How do each of us feel about that when we wake up in the morning? Do we have that feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm the only self-aware life in the universe. What should I do with this day? You know, turn on Netflix, go to Instagram. I'm not so sure. That's not so when you think about those things, like that's the meditation, right? Every single path is it's like a map, right? When you look at a map of San Francisco, no one would mistake that for San Francisco, but it helps you get to, you know, this bookstore. So that's the idea, is you just need a different map depending on your culture, to get to the same feeling, right? Like my teacher, Venerable Renee, in Tibetan Buddhism, they say there's a feeling of a kind of dharmakaya, they call it, which is a sense of kind of your consciousness expanding as big as the universe, let's say. And he said that's really the same feeling as feeling God's love, like for, you know, for a Christian who feels that. So they're paths to the same experience, and the metaphysics is different. And in this case, it's not metaphysics, it's physics.
Right, there you go. Yeah, and that's always been a gateway for me too. As you're talking, I'm thinking of a very traditional Tibetan Buddhist practice where you imagine offering the entire universe to your teachers. And it's described in this way according to ancient Indian culture of Mount Meru, and then these iron mountains and a couple of oceans and a couple of other things in there. And I would always imagine like those early Hubble telescope pictures of so many galaxies in one tiny little square inch. Because I was like, well, that's how the universe exists for me. That's how it works for my mind. So not feeling that we need to be so wedded to ancient Indian ideas of the nature of reality.
No, and I find it honestly more inspiring. And those particular ideas, a lot of them come from what's called the Abhidharma, which was kind of a compendium of different ideas about the universe from the time that it was written. And even His Holiness says, some of that needs to be revised. I heard something amazing recently, which is that all the fruits and vegetables that we eat, they say that it took 4,000 to 5,000 years for human beings to cultivate. Like they were all just little, almost inedible seeds and nubbins, like just things you would barely recognize as food, but they were edible. And over time, human beings, tasted one was slightly better than the other, and they planted those. But it took 4,000 years. Like for any individual human, they probably didn't even perceive the difference in their lifetime. So I think about that now when I think of precious life. That's one of the things I think about in the morning is thank you, 5,000 years of human beings just for, making the apples and peaches and onions and that go into my dinner every day. But you can go on and on, like with this meditation. Right. I find it much more inspiring than the ones from the culture of, Tibet and India, which were very inspiring for the people of that time. But we need logic that works for our minds today.
When you were going through this process, did you ever have moments where you were not sure that you were going in the right
direction? Going off the rails?
Yeah. Thank you for saying the thing.
People were asking me for 20 years, what book should I start with? I'm not Buddhist. I don't want to be Buddhist, but I'm curious about this type of meditation. And so that was the reason I started. But what I did was I would check with the audience as to whether it was generating the feeling in them. I'd check with myself, to see if I meditate, does it work? And then also my teachers, I kept notes and I took walks with Venerable Renee. I talked to you and other teachers, and also reading more of His Holiness's books. At first I was a little bit nervous about it, but after a while I felt like, it was legitimate. And the book has been looked over and corrected by 25, 30 people that helped weed out some of those mistakes too.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when I first started doing the compassion training, and one mutual friend of ours who's a Buddhist teacher said, "Oh, aren't you watering down Buddhism?" And I had to explain that I was very clear in that training what was Buddhism and what wasn't. And there's ultimate transcendent goals that we don't talk about in that training. We're just using the contemplative techniques to help people be more compassionate, which is a different end game. And so being very clear about what the end game is, because I think sometimes Buddhist teachers can water things down and they take out the hard bits, that are hard for people to grapple with. And then one question I have for you, because this is something I think about a lot myself, is how much of these things that we're taught very literally in our tradition are actually pointing to something more figurative. I remember the Tibetan nun Venerable Tsenla once saying to me, "You Westerners are so literal-minded, like you take everything so literally." And I'm like, wait, what? Are you telling me all these things that you've been teaching are not meant to be taken literally? And she's like, oh my God, So I kind of mull over that, like what is pointing to something? Like, is enlightenment really the state where you have countless emanation bodies and all of these transcendent states of mind, or is it pointing to something more figurative?
The literal slant in our culture is kind of ridiculous now. So in the Sistine Chapel, you have this picture of God, muscly white guy.
The old man in the sky.
I guarantee to you, nobody of that time thought God was a muscly white guy. Every single person looking at that painting understood that it was a metaphor, that it was just work, because we have bodies. We really relate to bodies. And the white people looking up at that ceiling at the time related to that as a symbol of God. Nobody thought God really looked like that. Today, for some reason, even though people don't believe in God, they think that God looked like that, a muscly white guy. But it's just a metaphor for the time. There's another quote, I think it's Dzongzar Khyentse Rinpoche. He said, as long as you call yourself a Buddhist, you are not yet a Buddha. This is one of my favorite quotes. So it's even quite strong there's a lot of people in this audience who call ourselves Buddhists, right? So if we ever really want to attain enlightenment, we'll have to let go of the idea that we're Buddhists too. And I find that very encouraging too. Like, you really, the word Buddhism is a duality, because it then differentiates between a non-Buddhist. Yeah. But the Buddha didn't call his teachings Buddhism. That would have been pretty egotistic, right? He just called it the Dharma, is like the truth. And test it for yourself. So it is a bit of a shame it's called Buddhism, despite how much I admire the Buddha. It really should still be called something like, reality.
Right. And then that metaphor that's often given is like, you use the boat to cross the river, but once you're on the other shore, you don't pick up the boat and keep carrying it along. You just kind of let it go. Yeah. But I think the literal mindedness, I think about that sometimes, about some of these ideas that are hard for people to accept, like rebirth in different realms of existence. And some teachers teach them as sort of metaphors for states of mind in the human existence, and even enlightenment is taught in some traditions quite differently.
Well, there's a quote I put in the book, which I heard when I was in college, and I love it, it was Voltaire. He said, "It's no more surprising to be born twice than born once."
Yeah.
And that's the thing. This is the thing. We're all totally clueless about. It's so much more amazing that we exist at all this one time than more than once.
Right,
so in many ways, living as beings that don't believe in past and future lives, our life is way more precious and urgent than for a Buddhist who could think, okay, maybe next time.
Yeah.
I know Buddhists like that, who are like, okay, next life. They're like, I'll do my prayers, and then next life I'll be a monk or nun or something like that.
Right.
Most people who aren't Buddhists don't have that option, so, you got to do something. There's another great quote that I put in the book, that Gottfried Leibniz. He said, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" Right? That's another one that it's just, if you think about, this is analytical meditation. It's thinking like this, questions like this every single day when you wake up. That's kind of what when I was a kid, I used to wake up with that kind of feeling, like, whoa, why is there something here at all?
Nothing.
That's the bigger question. Like, everyone gets into little mincing this and that, like, are there other planets with life and so on? But why is there anything at all?
Why is there this planet with us?
Yeah, and the whole universe. Because we have this idea of nothing. It's why people get so depressed a lot, because they have like nihilistic thoughts that you can become nothing. But Robert Thurman is very, very clear on this point, where he says the definition of nothing is that it doesn't exist, right? Like, if you think you become nothing when you die, what does that mean? It's a self-negating term. It just means something that doesn't exist. Something can't become nothing. It doesn't mean that your consciousness will evolve necessarily if you don't believe that. But you certainly don't become nothing, because nothing doesn't exist. All we have is something. Right?
No,
right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, you've mentioned a couple of times analytical meditation, which is something very much practiced in the Tibetan tradition. And like you, when I've discovered kind of the concept of neuroplasticity, I just loved it, because it explained how analytical meditation works. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that style of meditation, because it's quite different. So many people are used to mindfulness meditation, but I find analytical meditation is a little more of a rare style. Yeah,
so this is another place where we've had this tradition for at least 1,500 years, analytical meditation. So most people only know of one type of meditation, which we call stabilizing meditation. You might call mindfulness meditation, where you just focus your mind on one thing, usually your breath. And the purpose of that is to build concentration and to become less reactive, to let things pass through your mind. Analytical meditation is something most people haven't heard of, and basically, it's like a podcast you make for yourself in your head. It's a series of thoughts, feelings, emotions. It's a story you tell yourself to bring about your best qualities. That's the purpose of meditation. And so it's quite active. It's much easier for people to focus on. I like to say no one ever walked out of my 1-hour meditation classes, which is kind of amazing. And people can sit there and listen to a story or tell themselves a story much easier than trying to focus on their breath. And it's very creative also. It's kind of like, you know how jazz musicians, they have a kind of template, and then they riff on that. And it's the same thing. That's part of why I was encouraged to do this, because my own teachers and the tradition says, learn the outlines, which are quite sparse, and then fill in the details from your own life, your own experience, and so on. So yeah, that's analytical meditation. It uses thoughts, feelings, emotions, critical thinking also, being quite critical, in particular at thoughts. Like, does this thought lead to better states of mind, and does this thought lead to more disturbing states of mind? And the beauty of it is that this system that was validated, subjectively over, a couple thousand years, also has now a scientific validation from the principle of neuroplasticity. We used to think that, kids like my daughter here, only kids had brains that changed, and then it got fixed at a certain age when you're 25 and you can start renting a car. So now they found out that we're neuroplastic until the last day of our death. And that every single time you have a thought, it strengthens those neural connections. So it'll make you pause, because, the more you have a disturbing thought, a craving thought, an aggressive thought, a depressing thought, those do become habits. They become habits and patterns in your mind. And I'm not saying it's not okay to have those thoughts. It's fine. But they do, each of the thoughts we have reinforces it. So cultivating ones that steer our mind toward what we call virtue in Buddhism, but you could say happiness, satisfaction. That's analytical meditation, and it's been validated through neuroscience, positive psychology. Now they also call this field, which is funny. Psychology until 20 years ago only focused on problems, which is interesting. It only focused on negative states of mind. Now there's a positive psychology. There's also something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which I bet some people here have practiced, which is exactly the same thing. They teach you to look objectively at your thoughts, try to see how some of them might be exaggerated, and then deliberately cultivate a thought that counteracts that feeling to bring you back to some state of balance, healthy state of mind, and even a very positive one, state of happiness, joy.
Yeah, one of my teachers would laugh and say, we're doing analytical meditation all the time to increase qualities like our anger. Yeah. Like somebody does something that harms you, and what do? You think about it, and you mull over it and replay it in your head, and think of all of these reasons why you're right and they're wrong, and you're such a victim. And he goes, we're doing that all the time. Just do it with the right kind of meditation instead of increasing the qualities like anger, that like ruminate on compassion, ruminate on kindness, and develop these positive qualities.
Well, it proves that you're able to concentrate, right? Because when you really want something, like say if you really want a partner, or if you really want a job, or you really want peace in the Middle East, for example, you can think about that for hours, like without thinking about anything else. So it's quite encouraging. You can see you have the power to concentrate. So then it's a matter of learning what are the thoughts that actually make your life happier, make you more an effective, advocate, activist. I'm not trying to say this is like a Pollyanna path where you're just skipping and happy while bombs are falling, halfway across the world. It actually makes you more effective at fighting problems like that in the world, because you're not overwhelmed by negative emotions like anger, depression, despair. Analytical meditation, the whole purpose, right, of the Buddhist path is just to align your mind with reality. Like, these things are happening. All of these things are happening in the world right now. We cannot deny that. But how can I be some small cause for a positive change?
And that brings me to another thing you talk about in the book. You have a whole section called Meditating for the Wrong Reasons. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that attitude and what we sometimes call like a spiritual bypass, and how we can use meditation as a sort of escapism.
Every time I teach meditation at Kyoto, someone's there who hasn't taken meditation. So one of the very first things I say is, meditation isn't relaxing. I'm so sorry. If you come here because if you come to meditation for relaxation, then you start to compare it with all the other ways you could relax. Like, okay, meditation, going for a nice walk, having a drink, smoking a joint, watching Netflix. It doesn't compare well to those things in terms of relaxing. Those other things are more relaxing than meditation for many people. Let's just be honest. So that's not the purpose. But all those 5 things I listed after meditation, they don't bring out your best qualities. They don't make you your best self. So that's the purpose of meditation. And it's just like exercise. Most people don't go to exercise because they just love it. It's because it makes them healthy and it makes their mind feel better for the rest of the day, and it's going to make them live another 25 years. So that's part one, is just meditation isn't relaxing. Oh, what was the other part you were asking about?
The bypass?
Yeah, the bypass,
the spiritual bypass.
So then, once you do meditate, though, there is a thing that I experienced myself. It's a great new term that I think never existed in Tibetan or Indian culture, but only in ours, which is spiritual bypass, which is using meditation as a kind of, really almost like a kind of drug, like a way of allowing your life to continue in a harmful way, but having a meditation practice that just balances it out. And the way I think you can tell whether your meditation is a bypass is that you have a meditation session, you think it's so great, oh, I had amazing vision and I'm so relaxed and calm. Then you come down, you have a fight with your partner, and I'm speaking from personal experience. That's where, I once asked Venerable Sangye Kadro, how do you measure the success of your meditation? And she didn't say, oh, it's how long you can concentrate or how you have certain lights or visions. She said, it's if your relationships get better.
Yeah.
That's really, really critical. And so I think that's the honest measure of meditation. And it's kind of shocking, I think, for a lot of people when they hear that. It certainly was for me.
One of the founding faculty of the compassion cultivation training that was developed at Stanford, Leah Weiss, and I heard she works as a consultant and a meditation teacher, and she comes into these companies, and she says she won't take a contract if she feels like the company wants her to teach the employees meditation so they can maintain completely unsustainable lifestyles and just work 80 hours a week because they're having 3 15-minute breaks a day to meditate so that they can stay productive. And she's like, no, that's not the reason for it. And you need to give people a reasonable life and hours and not expect them to work these crazy days. So I think there's an ethical piece that often, some of the critiques of the mindfulness movement is they don't explicitly name that ethical piece, and a lot of teachers are talking about that now too, that it needs to be brought more explicitly into the conversation. Yeah.
There's a path that's recommended for people who aren't monastics. There's all these numbered lists in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, but there's ethics, concentration, and wisdom is this path that's recommended for lay people. But those come in order. Like it says, you cannot concentrate if you live an unethical life, even in small ways. And I say from my own experience, like if you go around saying harmful, rude, passive, aggressive things, it's like, your mind's agitated. You can't sleep. Your relationships aren't good. You certainly can't meditate. Those things come back. His Holiness the Dalai Lama even said he doesn't have it yet recently, which kind of blew my mind. And I don't know if he was saying that just to make us feel better or something, but that was surprising.
What you just said about ethics reminds me of a Theravadan monk I heard once use a phrase, the bliss of blamelessness. And trust me, I am a veteran of sitting down to meditate and having a mind filled with regret that I've treated people badly or done some actions of harm, and then that becomes the meditation is the regret and not having this peaceful mind. So I've really seen it from my own standpoint. And so kind of the mental cause and effect, I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, well, the Buddhist view is more like karmic seed. So in the mental cause and effect, it's more just this acknowledgement that we have now from neuroscience and psychology that, positive ways of thinking lead to more positive states of mind, negative lead to more negative states of mind. But the bigger thing that I do in that chapter is more like how to deal with when we do negative things. Because I still regret, the things I've done to hurt people. I remember something I said to a kid in 6th grade by accident. Totally by accident, that I still really, really regret. So in that chapter, one of the biggest things I focus on is more like how to forgive yourself. Because then if you don't forgive yourself, then you actually keep being mean to the other people around you too. It's a real nightmare. So you really do need to do that. And I bring in a practice from Tibetan Buddhism with visualization, but without a kind of deity. The first part is thinking about all the good things you did today. Because everybody does more good things than, almost everybody, just about everybody. Everybody in this room for sure does more good things than bad every single day. And so that rejoicing, they say this is like the laziest meditation you can possibly do and has so much benefit. You don't even have to sit cross-legged. Just kick back on a couch. Yeah. And when you come home, you're tired. Think, what are the good things? I made breakfast for my daughter. We told a joke. We gave a nice talk at a bookstore. Just think through. There's so many basic good things that we all do every day. So build that up huge in your mind, and then go through, a couple of negative ones. Forgive yourself. Yeah. So it's very much more practical, because you can't do anything about the past. Obviously, this is not like the most esoteric Buddhist teaching. We can't do anything up to right now. Yeah. But we have the beauty of the Buddhist path is that it says people are fundamentally good. And we can debate this if anyone has that in question. But it says people are fundamentally good.
When you said, thinking and mulling over the mean thing you said in 6th grade, and I had an experience when I was in my first long meditation retreat, and I always make a joke that you think you're a really nice person until you go into solitary confinement with your mind for years. Yeah. About 6 months into this long retreat, I was just completely overwhelmed with remorse. This was like 3 days of every regret, including 2nd grade and everything, like every single one. And I was just like, I am just the most horrible, terrible person. And then I almost heard this voice in my head going, you just need to forgive yourself and just accept that you weren't perfect. Like, big surprise. The Buddha said, no, we're a work in progress, So the self-forgiveness and just kind of allowing myself the rejoicing over the good deeds, because it was so hard to do that too. We have this negativity bias. We're always focusing on the negative, including ourselves. And there's a student from Seichunling, and I remember years ago, Leopoldo, and he grew up in Mexico, and he said when he was a kid, he'd go into the confessional with the priest and be racking his brains thinking of things to confess. And it's like, oh, I pulled my little sister's pigtails. Is that bad enough? He's just a kid. And then he said, oh, how wonderful would it have been to have a rejoicinal right next to the confessional. And then I could have told the priest all the great things that I did. He was like, that would have created such a different mind when I was a little kid. If I was all excited to tell the priest all the really awesome things that I did too. I helped my little sister with her homework more times than I pulled her pigtails. So it's that bias we have on the negative, and it's really hard to shift that for us sometimes.
Yeah, and it's really unclear. We know so much more about trauma now, like Besser van der Kolk's book and so on, and asking people to talk through a traumatic experience they had is, in general, like the worst thing you can do for you don't want them to relive that trauma. Like, you need ways to process it, and we won't get into, and I don't talk about that much in the book. But you do need to somehow build a more constructive mind and start with the self-forgiveness, absolutely just accepting.
Your task in this book and in your life of kind of reframing some of the most traditional Buddhist teachings through this sort of psychological and scientific lens. And it reminds me of, I think it was an essay that I read long ago that was talking about kind of the spread of Buddhism from the Ganges Valley in northern India through the various Asian countries where it spread. And this person was saying every time it kind of spread to a new country, it took on a different flavor. And so when I read that essay, I was thinking about Buddhism being transmitted to, the so-called West. I don't really like that term, but kind of Europe, non-Asian countries. And I thought, our worldview really isn't even Christianity or Judaism. It's really psychology and science. But it made me think of, what do you think as the future of Buddhism as a religious tradition?
I don't even know what to say about the word religion. It's just about living a meaningful, purposeful, good life. Until very recently, about 200 years ago, 300 years ago, there were only religions, and you had to choose one, or you were born into one. And now most people aren't religious in the United States. But I don't know what I would even say about that word. It's just, I really like this idea, like, as long as you call yourself a Buddhist, you're not yet a Buddha. It's more like, get practical about what we can do in our lives Like I heard someone ask the Dalai Lama once, how can you say that your goal is peace on earth? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I've heard him ask this many times, actually. And he always says the same thing. And he says, you know what? You're right. He said, we're not going to end wars. It's not realistic. But if you have the ideal of peace on earth, then you're going to get as far toward that ideal in your life as possible. So much further than someone has a weaker goal, like, just, I don't know, peace in San Francisco, or none at all, which sadly most of us have no goal at all. We just give up and say it's impossible.
I don't know, especially this year with all the things that are going on, the conflicts, the presidential race that are between two people that it's hard for us to get excited about, either one, just to be honest. Yeah. What keeps you kind of getting out of bed in the morning and doing the work you do and keeps you going? I
did a long retreat at home in January, and I had this feeling at a certain point during the retreat where it's one thing to say it, it's another thing to feel it. And I really felt it, that everything up to this moment right now had to be this way. I mean, it's tautological, right? Like, of course it did. Everything from the Middle East, Ukraine, conflicts in our own life, divorces, etc. There's no way things could have been any other than the way they led up to this very moment. And so much of our pain comes from actually reeling against that and just wishing, if I'd only done that, why did that happen? Why me? Why did them? Why this? How could they be doing that? How could they be dropping their bombs? They did it. It happened. We cannot change everything up to this moment. But then the hopeful part, everyone around me has an infinite capacity to change the world for the better and ourselves for the better. And the demonstrated ability of individuals to have such enormous impact in the world. Like, look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela. It's not to say you have to do something huge. It was Navalny recently said, he was quoted after he died. He said, there's no fault in doing little, only in doing none, doing nothing, right? I love that. That's another new mantra for me,
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think, I notice sometimes working with students, they almost get overwhelmed before they take the first step because they think they need to start a new 501c3 nonprofit to solve some huge problem. And I had a friend who was a Zen monk in San Francisco in the 80s and 90s, and he would just go from bedside to bedside helping people who were dying of AIDS, who didn't have a family and didn't have caregivers. And I remember once he said to me, it's so easy. Somebody just trips and falls in front of you. You just stop and pick them up. Yeah. That's all. Yeah. And I think we think it needs to be so big that we don't do the little actions that collectively will lead to massive change. I have a memory of hiding under the desks as a school child in the midst of the Cold War, and then the Soviet Union, which seemed monolithic and permanent, just sort of dissolved from within. It couldn't sustain itself. So all of these, spending the 80s protesting against apartheid in South Africa, and then going to the Oakland Coliseum to see Nelson Mandela when he was released. And just seeing that change, and it happens through so many people doing the small thing and not the nothing, and just having faith.
And that is one of the things that gives me hope, is that, many of us here in 1989, we just woke up and boom, the Berlin Wall fell. But also looking back in history, most of my ancestors are Jewish. Like we had the Holocaust, we were fighting the Germans. Now the Germans are our closest ally. So it is possible. There is hope. Like everything is. Change is possible.
Well, we want to open it up for questions, but I just want to really thank you for the work that you're doing. I'm going to buy a case of your book and give it to everybody that I know. I think it's just such a wonderful, kind of very, very clear, super accessible, and there hasn't been one like that that's come out in a long time that just explains the path in such a clear, accessible way. So thank you for all the effort you put into it.
Yeah, you're one of my favorite people to talk to, so this was really fun. Yeah.
That was super fun. Thank you. Karen.
I had a question about gratitude. I didn't really mention it as a subject, as a theme, and I noticed in my experience that a lot of people have a hard time reflecting on maybe the good that they've done, but seeing the good that's been done for them.
Yeah.
They seem to have an easier time with. And what are your thoughts on gratitude as a reflection for meditation, for analytical meditation?
Yeah, so where does gratitude fit into the path? Yeah. So where I put it in this particular, reframing of the Lam Rim, it was mostly in that cause and effect. So you start just with yourself in the cause and effect and rejoice in everything good that you did and everything good that happened to you. And then later when you get to the compassion topics, rejoicing in all the good of everything that happened to your friend. So when you do this rejoicing meditation, you do it for everybody. It's funny in Tibetan Buddhists because they have this kind of spiritual math where they say if you rejoice in something of a person who is like of inferior ability to you, let's just say like Vladimir Putin or something, he's definitely, then you get like twice their merit. Then if you rejoice in something of someone of equal value to you, you get equal merit. And if you rejoice in the good of somebody superior to you, like the Dalai Lama, you get half the merit. So they say, again, it's very lazy, like to sit. And I do that. I'll sit at home and think, wow, what did the Dalai Lama do today? Like, good for him. Good for him. And because in Tibetan Buddhism, they say there's this kind of accounting, like a big balance sheet of accounting. But it works through neuroplasticity. You don't have to believe in the giant, Excel sheet in the sky. It does just work through habituation. And the more you think about the good things the Dalai Lama did, eventually you start to do, similar ones. So yeah, I think gratitude, it is one of the scientifically validated practices, but I think it comes in cause and effect and love, compassion. Yeah.
Thank you, Scott.
Oh yeah, over there.
What do you have to say about practices like purification that we're taught very early on?
So the question is, what do you have to say about practice like purification? So this is really, I talk about this in the book because I do go through the meditation in a secular version that still uses some visualization. Like you use a bright white light and you imagine this light filling your body and getting rid of like the negativities, the regrets and illness and things like that. And what I say about this is that, it may seem kind of new age, like airy-fairy to think of light purifying you, but when you actually think about it, everything we experience is electromagnetic radiation. Like it's not like some weird living light like you see in a Marvel movie or something like that. Everything actually is light. And when you look at quantum physics, I interviewed Carlo Rovelli, amazing physicist, and he said like basically the way, when you look at the math of quantum mechanics, it's like there's a message, but there's no sender and there's no receiver. So that's really what life is. What we are experiencing now is it's only light.
Scott, I was really inspired by what you said about fruit. And I was just wondering, there are certain images that, and this might feel like a 101 question, but like the Bodhi tree and the lotus flower, and I wonder if you might speak about anything about the natural world.
The main thing about the natural world is that we are part of it, right? Like we talk about reconnecting with nature or going to nature, but I think the biggest problem is that people think that we're not part of nature, but we are. Like we are absolutely part of nature. So and that's the only way we can harm our environment so much is by thinking it's separate from us. So that idea of interdependence is like it's the universal antidote. Like in Buddhism, it comes late on the path generally, but nothing else they say actually really works except that antidote of eliminating dualistic thinking and moving towards an utter sense of absolute interconnectedness that is not at all supernatural. Like I find the scientific validation way more powerful than the more logical, philosophical, because we know so much about science and our bodies and the natural world and evolution, cosmic evolution, that all the heavy elements in us came from exploding stars. We're all made of supernovas that happened more than 4 billion years ago. Every single particle in our body came, these kind of ideas, right? So if you actually felt that all the time, there's no way you could, probably pour gas into your car or do all kinds of things. Just wouldn't make sense anymore.
there's a interfaith climate justice group that I've become involved in Santa Cruz. It was actually started in Jewish communities, and we made it interfaith in Santa Cruz. It's called Dayenu, and we're having an interfaith service during Earth Week, and I was sharing with the other faith leaders all the significant events in the Buddha's life happened under a tree. And that's not an accident, so that kind of points to that same kind of connection. It's not just, there were trees all over the place. It's like a specific tree was involved in every single, major event in the Buddha's life. So I find that interesting to contemplate.
Yeah. Yeah, if you ever read The Overstory, it's a beautiful novel about that, and he talks about all the science behind why we like being in nature. Because trees actually, why do you feel good in nature? It's actually not just what you see and hear. The trees actually have chemicals that they outgas that make you feel good. They're drugs. The trees are communicating with us. Again, not in an airy-fairy way, but just through chemicals that make you feel, good.
And my friend Eve Ekman, who teaches right across the street at the Dharma Collective, and she shared research with me recently that there's been research done that we actually, different things happen to us physiologically, especially when we're in biodiverse wild nature versus even walking in a park or a botanical garden. Like we get soothed in all of this, things happen physiologically just being in any kind of nature, but especially biodiverse nature, there's a huge difference because that's how we evolved, to live. So I find that kind of compelling.
Yeah, Renée says the reason we like nature is because there's no objects of attachment. Like there's not a pair of jeans you want to buy or something hanging on a branch. It's just, you just feel at ease and you don't want to take any away. Although I have a garden, sometimes I feel like, I wish I could pull up that plant. But in general, you're just happy.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Or one more? What? Yeah.
I'm asking this with an apology in advance. What does art and the concept of art have to do with all of this?
You're asking the right
What does
person.
What does art have to do with all this? There's a lot of different takes in art from the Buddhist path. I'll just answer it more personally, though, which is I really like the idea that art is a way to reflect, for society to reflect itself to itself. And, it's amazing when you go to a museum, like I was at the British Museum recently in London, and it's amazing that that's all that really survives, that we value from an entire civilization. Few of the leaders are even remembered, Marcus Aurelius, whatever. But the art, this jug that somebody made or a painting, and that it preserves like the beauty and the richness of the cultures. So that's what I think about art. It's whether it's a song, a dance performance, a book. At first when I wrote this book, I thought it was more kind of service oriented, because I was trying to write a novel, and I thought that was really the art. But as this finally got to its later stages, I really did become proud of the craft of the sentences and the artistry, and I felt like it was possible to infuse a nonfiction, self-help book with a level of artistry and entertainment. I like the word entertainment too, which is sort of like valuing people's time. If you're entertaining them about something useful, making it worthwhile, making it fun to read. So I don't know. We can talk about art for a long time, but that's all I have to say.
So maybe we should move to the book signing table.
Yeah,
Thank you all so much for coming today. Great to be here with you. Thank you, Scott. Yay!
Thanks for joining us for the San Francisco book release event for How to Train a Happy Mind with Tenzin Chogkyi. If you want to get a copy of How to Train a Happy Mind, you can find it in paper, ebook, and audiobook format anywhere you buy books. If you'd like to go deeper in your meditation practice, on our website you can sign up for our newsletter and join our Train a Happy Mind community that meets weekly for lectures, meditations, and discussions. Please also consider making a donation to our podcast if you have the means. A Skeptic's Path to Enlightenment is a nonprofit organization. Our podcast and programs are free and ad-free thanks to our generous donors. To support us now, visit our website at skepticspath.org. We accept cash, credit, Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrencies, and your donations are tax-deductible in the U.S. Thanks to Annie Nguyen for production and story editing, Christian Parry for mastering, and Isabella Acebal for marketing. We wish you a wonderful day.